Welcome to the Supply Chain Revolution podcast. I'm your host, Sheri Hinish, also called the Supply Chain Queen, joined by co-host James George. Today, we're taking you on a journey from the current reality of supply chains as instruments of conflict to an inspiring vision of what's possible when we harness the Global South's momentum to build regenerative frontiers. Our guide is the infamous Dr. Gautam Desirayu, one of India's most distinguished scientists and co-author of India's Supply Chains in a World at War. But here's what's fascinating. Within this analysis of conflict and power lies the blueprint for something truly transformative. How the Global South's strategic positioning could enable regenerative supply chain models that create positive value rather than extract from it. So let's start this journey together. Dr. Desirayu, I would love for you to introduce yourself and give folks a little bit of background in your origin story before we dig into the podcast. Over to you.
I am Gautam Desiraju, a structural chemist and now Professor Emeritus in the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. And I am very happy to introduce my new book, India's Supply Chains in a World at War, co-authored with a young lawyer called Dikit Bhattacharya from Delhi. And in this book, we describe how the matter of supply chains has gone from the domestic to the international and the global supply chains, especially in a time of change and conflict, how we constantly need to calibrate the responses of various countries. In short, supply chains, from merely being complicated, have now become complex.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. You mentioned that it reveals how supply chains have evolved from sort of efficiency-focused systems to front lines of global conflict. And through your 7 case studies, semiconductors, critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, fertilizer, energy, AI, extraterrestrial logistics, what does this new reality look like?
We've gone from a system of efficiency to resilience. In other words, supply chains have gone from just in time to just in case, because we are not sure as to how other countries will behave in these anarchic times. So as a result, we have to build in a lot for the unpredictability of events. The theme of the book is really in this anarchic regime. We call it, using Sanskrit words, Matsya Nyaya, which means the law of the fishes. So the law of the fishes says that the big fish eat the small fish. And this is what happens in a time of anarchy. So the big countries will have a dominating role in what the small countries do. And in this totally anarchic situation, what does a lesser power like India do when it is faced with the actions of the two great powers of today, the US and China? So I think that is the way in which things are moving. And could we possibly go from this adversarial situation to something where countries cooperate with each other so that the supply chain doesn't become a weapon, but it is something that countries can use jointly so that they all win? Basically a win-win instead of a zero-sum game.
I guess I'm curious, what's the opportunity then for someone like India stuck between these two sort of opposing forces of the US and China? How do those stuck in the middle use this as an opportunity?
Well, go back to the rules of war. If you read people like Sun Tzu or Clausewitz, when the two biggies are fighting with each other, pretty badly, if I may say so. I mean, just in the last few days, China has imposed export restrictions on the rare earth elements in response to the US action, I think last year, when they put an export ban on chips to China. So this kind of a trade war can only weaken both these countries, in my view. So what does the third power do? This third power is considerably less powerful today, but using the usual war strategy and not tactics, more strategy. Are there things that it can do with the US that will displease China, and do things with China that will displease the US, so that it keeps these two big powers guessing? And as I like to say, India now has a chance to go to the high table without paying an entrance fee. So it will depend on the policymakers in India to think out where we can capitalize on our strengths. And I think the case studies actually show this. The thing that I think is of immediate relevance to us is the semicon, the pharmaceuticals, and the strategic minerals. It's in these sectors, I think, where India has the best chance. And I think the transactional nature of the modern world also will help us because there are no permanent friends and enemies. So, what we may do with China, with pharma, need not upset the US, and what we do with the US with semicon need not upset China, basically.
Can I just build on that for a moment? Because I think in my head, is there a third way, right? To use your analogy before about kind of big fishes and little fishes, is there an opportunity in that example for India to be the champion for the smaller players down the food chain,
Absolutely.
and potentially establish a different order, a different
Yes.
approach, a different way of coming up against that challenge?
I think our recent activities in Africa, if you were to consider Africa, is a bit similar to what China has done. I mean, China, when it went into Ethiopia, it started building railway lines and roads and airports basically for free because it figured out that there was some oil in Ethiopia. And indeed, the oil was found. So when the various companies came to Ethiopia, they were bound to favor China slightly. I think here, India and China both being Asian countries, this is very important. We strongly do believe in Asia that things have to be done so that it becomes win-win and not adversarial. So we help them with soft power so that then they can give back to us. So my idea in the supply chain is that it just doesn't flow in one direction. It can flow in many segments, even in the backward direction. Now, with all humility, let me say that in the past, when the US has tried to come into various countries in the third world, the script that it follows is slightly different. Generally, it starts with some kind of attempt at regime change and then try to put in people who it thinks will be better for it and try to influence the future course of action in these countries through these leaders. But generally, the track record of the US in this business has been little less than average. If you take Afghanistan or Iran, especially, and Chile, South America, it's had a mixed record. Yeah? And this is where this new model, this third model, what you say, James, this win-win is very, very typically Asian. Let me tell you that. And it is something that is not altogether familiar to Western audiences because, mm, again, I
It's
don't
a
want to sound
history of
preachy. I
plundering
don't
and
want to sound preachy,
colonialism.
but it's a kind of adversarial thing. It's always a question of one person has to win and one person has to lose. Whereas our entire way of thinking in Asia is that everyone can win because the world is too complicated, too difficult to handle. So we all realize that we need one another. We have a phrase in Sanskrit which I may quote, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. That is, the whole world is a family.
Oh, I love
Kutumba
that.
means family. And so Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is coming from the ancient scriptures. So we clearly recognize the holistic nature of things and people having to live in harmony with nature, and supply chains, a very modern thing, can still be accommodated in this very ancient model, which has served this continent very well in the past.
One final thread: is it too is it too much of a simplification then to say this is an act of decolonizing resilience? Is that what this is? Are we unpicking some of that, or is it more cultural in the sense, as you mentioned, of the sort of the win-win approach?
No, excuse me. I don't think you are oversimplifying it at all. It is a matter of decolonizing. And those of us in India still feel that we are still living in part in the colonial hangover. And we need to educate other countries in Asia and Africa, because the question I've asked recently in an article of mine is how do Indians think? So how a society, how a nation thinks will often determine its policies. I think you've got to the heart of the matter when you talk about decolonization.
If we zoom out and we think about, 10 years from now, what would regenerative supply chain frontiers look like in your point of view?
10 years from now, I think it will be a blend. It will be a blend of adversarial and cooperation. And 10 years from now, the balance of these four empires, the US and China and India and Russia, will be behaving to each other in certain dynamic ways. Added to this is the extra factor that three of these four empires are in the Eurasian landmass. So we have great many logistic advantages in dealing with each other, trading with each other, and most important, thinking like each other. We can see signs of this already. All the problems happening in the last few months in Afghanistan itself. Afghanistan is a point where these three empires meet, and traditionally it's always been a buffer zone. And this means that the empires, the three Eurasian empires, are talking to each other. And I'll give you a practical example. Today, India and China are in an adversarial relationship with regards to pharmaceuticals. They have weakened our manufacturing capability and reduced us to the level of formulations. Now, in the future, you say, how might I see things happening? I think in a very few years, both countries use this cluster idea, where a number of companies use common facilities to either manufacture or formulate. Now, I can see Chinese scientists coming and technologists coming to India to learn formulation. And I can see Indian scientists and technologists going to China to learn manufacture. So I think we'll have groups of Chinese and Indian scientists working in both countries. We may be even using a common BRICS currency by then. And I think, Sheri and James, the whole idea of the supply chain itself may change. It will be something much more organic and complex. The catalyst for all this is the diminishing importance of the US dollar. I think this is going to have profound changes on supply chains.
There's a future in which that does happen, but there's also a future in which that doesn't happen, that the dollar might continue to climb. But I wonder, just back to your point about the sort of blend, in my limited experience, one of the key factors of the way businesses and supply chains operate in India is the cooperative, which I think is a model and a mechanism that doesn't really exist in the Western world in the same way. We have cooperatives, but they are definitely not the same as you see in India. And what you just described there felt a little bit like a sort of a kind of international level cooperative. Is that, when you think about 10 years from now, to Sheri's point, is it the global supply chain learning more about the way business is done in India? Or do we need a new expectation of how these relationships have to be formed?
I can answer in two parts. The first one, I hope, doesn't sound too condescending.
Go
But
ahead.
We've been around 5,000 years. With not much of a change in the way in which we think, behave, act. So despite a number of invasions and various setbacks, the essential nature of India and, dare I say, China too, I've visited several times, like I'm sure both of you have. There is a certainly great deal of similarity between us and China, and for that matter, Japan too. And this combination, maybe the Eurasian combination and the American combination, I think they will learn to live with each other. Two of the chapters in our book, the case studies, one is artificial intelligence and one is extraterrestrial. Now, the extraterrestrial supply chains will definitely bring both the Hemisphere and the Eurasian sphere together. There's no doubt about it, because outer space really belongs to all of us. I think it's a wonderful time to be alive for those of us who like to observe these things, because this dynamic nature of things, the world has been pretty static for the last 70 years. I hope there are intelligent ones among us in the bureaucratic and political class. I still sometimes have my doubts about that. But to the extent that they do inhabit these spaces, I think people like, our politicians, our bureaucrats, our technocrats, industrialists, they should start looking at this and take a slightly longer term view of things.
I love what you both have just unpacked, because as I'm listening and reflecting, there are two terms with a supply chain background are front of mind. The first is agglomeration. And you think about by sector, how skills and manufacturing have commingled and are co-located specifically around this concept of agglomeration. And what you described, Professor, with shared skills and shared knowledge and ways of working amongst China and India specifically, when you were talking about pharma. I thought that was really brilliant. The second concept was industrial symbiosis. And listening to the two of you, I thought about the next evolution, or one of the regenerative frontiers for supply chains in 10 years will be intellectual symbiosis, Whereas technology and AI continues to evolve and advance, and the cost of these advanced manufacturing technologies become quite low, it's really the thinking, and I would even argue the ancestral symbiosis that connects countries and connects minds and connects cultures and connects human beings to something much larger than themselves, much larger than the countries in which they belong to. And these regional clusters, I think that's the next frontier too, like you mentioned, ASEAN. It's incredibly inspiring. And then also, as someone who lives in the United States and as an American, knowing what's going on right now, a bit scary for someone like me, right? Who's sitting in a country where we have a president and commander in chief who is ordering that immigrants be pulled out of their car vehicles while they're in an elementary school pickup line for their third grader. That to me, it's a very stark contrast. So I love all of the positive thoughts that you're bringing to the conversation and what the world may look like in a new regenerative frontier for supply chains. I still keep coming back to how variable and unpredictable geopolitical risk is and the influence that that actually has on everything that we're talking about and a lot of the concepts in your new book.
It's hard not to go back to the previous point because I think we could talk about that all day. But I think you're right. There's a very strange geopolitical tension here. We almost in our heart of hearts know that's where we've got to get to, this idea of sort of clustering and hyperlocalization. But it feels like vested interest of our current system is what's really getting in the way at the moment, which is to your point, Sheri. My previous experience was, how do we take a different approach to this rather than, when we think about partnerships from someone who has power and influence and probably capital and someone who has a need, and actually the dynamics shifting to where you're all making this party the sort of center, they are the client, and we need to bring together the right funders and the right expertise to actually solve a problem so that the whole system thrives. How do we bring tri-sector partnerships into a conventional supply chain relationship? How do we rethink the way that the dynamics within that supply chain need to change in order to drive the right kind of outcome?
Regional cooperation, shared infrastructure, government, corporate, community partnership.
Absolutely. I think this kind of summarizes not only what we have discussed. India is a key player in our new multipolar world. It is managing its supply chains in a regenerative manner already, even in the present condition of the law of the fishes, which, in other words, to use Professor Mearsheimer's language, offensive realism. India is showing the world that supply chains need not be of a purely commercial and exploitative nature, but can also be societal between countries, and therefore they become regenerative. Because culture and society, that goes on forever. With India becoming one of the new empires of the 21st century, its innate civilizational nature can only take both India and the world from conflict to cooperation and to mutual confidence.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Desirayu, for taking us on this journey from conflict and warfare to endless possibilities and a future that we can all be proud of. Your insights show us that within the current disruption and all the chaos that we may see when we turn on our televisions or look at our smartphone, there's tremendous opportunity to build something that's fundamentally better. Supply chains that can regenerate, and that connection between culture and community, that is something that is truly special and should be coveted. This can be the foundation for shared prosperity rather than zero-sum competition. So thank you so much. And if you wouldn't mind, just a quick plug, you have a new book that is being released on November 18th.
It's called India's Supply Chains in a World at War. The book will release on November 18th. My publisher tells me that it will be on pre-order in Amazon on October 18th. Usually, from my past experience, it will come initially on Amazon India, and after a few weeks or so, it comes in worldwide Amazon.
Thank you, Uncle. And how long have you been in academia, just for folks listening?
Started my career as an independent researcher in chemistry in 1979, and till about 2010, I was strictly a hardcore structural chemist and crystallographer with a passing interest in world affairs and things, mostly because the political situation in my country was so chaotic. It's after that that I started getting much more seriously involved. And finally, it has come out in a series of books, one of which is the supply chains book. There's another one on how to fix Indian science, which right now seems to be in not such a good shape. It needs some medicines. So life goes on. God is great. So I think in that kind of a spirit, I'm generally I'm bullish and optimistic, not only about India, but the whole world.
Wonderful. And that's why
I'm
you're such an amazing guest.
and I mean, and it has been amazing, like genuinely amazing, Professor. I think, in this very short conversation, and whenever it makes its way to the UK, looking forward to trying to get hold of the book. We talked about kind of decolonizing resilience. We talked about strategic autonomy through regeneration. The language that you use in framing this topic sings to me, given a previous life in the military, this idea of reframing warfare as design. And Sheri, you were touching on then about kind of almost the ethical rebalancing of the conversation around this. So it's been really fascinating. So thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you, and you're most welcome. Namaste.
Namaste.